Hi everyone. I told you I'd do an update to the Boise, Idaho collapse that occurred on January 31st, 2024 that killed 3 people and injured seriously at least 8 others. OSHA is allowed to complete their findings within a 6-month period, and they pretty much took up that entire period, and on July 26th released their citations relative to the contractors who were involved with this project, and presumably if anybody else had been at fault, they would have cited them as well. But they've cited Big D Builders and Inland Crane. So I'm going to go over this and go through it line by line on the citations. So at the time, there was some doubt as to whether the steel that was being erected for this 39,000 square foot building collapsed or if it was a crane that had collapsed, although the initial indications were that it was the collapse of the structure itself that pulled the crane down to the ground and broke its boom. And interestingly, at the time, there had been 4 cranes in operation at the site, but at the time of the collapse, only 1 was being utilized. The other 3 had been moved out. So I want to go back to an earlier statement here. At the time of the accident, the final crane was in service to place an end truss. When the building collapsed due to an unknown structural failure, the crane boom, the hydraulic arm of the equipment, snapped on impact. And it references OSHA investigating the accident. So as I mentioned, the Department of Labor, which is over OSHA, had this press release, and there's links to these individual citations. So I'll include a link to this press release in the description for this video if you want to check it out yourself. Now let's go over the citations for Big D Builders. They were the contractor, erection contractor responsible for assembling this hangar building. And one of the principals involved with that firm was killed during this collapse. So citation 1, item 1, type of violation, serious. A firm properly graded drained area was not readily accessible to work with adequate space for the safe storage of materials and the safe operation of the erector's equipment. On January 31st, 2024, which is the day of the collapse, and at times prior thereto, steel erection work occurred in mud and areas of standing water. Equipment including scissor lifts, aerial lifts, and rough terrain forklifts were used throughout the site. So it sounds like a messy site. One of the things I initially thought is whether it was a possibility that there had been a bearing capacity failure at the support leg for one of these cranes that led to the collapse. And that wasn't indicated here. It's just general sloppy working conditions that constrain their ability to properly operate equipment for this erection. Now we have citation 1, item 2, type of violation, again serious. Rigid frames did not have 50% of their bolts or the number of bolts specified by the manufacturer, whichever is greater, installed and tightened on both sides of the web adjacent to each flange before the hoisting equipment is released. Many of you in the comments said you suspected exactly that there weren't sufficient number of fasteners installed here during this erection. Item A, frame line 5, on January 31, 2024, and at times prior thereto, the bolts and heavy hex nuts were not tightened, including but not limited to those connecting structural steel at splice number 1. On the south side of the column 5E, none of the 12 bolts were fully tightened. Item B, frame line 4, on January 31, 2024, and at times prior thereto, bolts and heavy nuts were not tightened at another column location 4E. And then on item 3, same story, on column 3E, at least 8 of the 12 bolts were not tightened. So that indicates 3 column connections that didn't have an adequate number of bolts, or the bolts there weren't adequately tightened. Citation 1, item 3, type of violation, serious. The employer did not ensure each contractor had been provided proper training in the hazards associated with the connecting. On January 31, 2024, and at times prior thereto, employees were engaged in the erection of an engineered metal building to be used as an aircraft hangar with 300-foot-long spans. Workers engaged in connecting had not received training to include bolt tightening requirements and torquing methods, including for direct tension indicator washers. Well, that's pretty damning. It suggests that they just simply didn't know what they were doing. Item B, on January 31, 2024, and at prior times thereto, employees were engaged in the erection of an engineered metal building. Workers, including those engaged in connecting, had not received training to include erection procedures to ensure for the structural stability of long span rafters. So it sounds like the work was done in a sloppy, non-workmanlike manner, not consistent with manufacturer requirements or industry standards. This is the most serious citation. Citation 2, Item 1, type of violation, willful, serious. Structural stability was not maintained at all times during the erection process. So it talks about the long assembled bays were placed and joined at the middle peak. Each day, the solid web structural I-beam rafters were observed bending / curved lengthwise. Columns were observed out of plumb, and numerous 1/4 inch wire rope cables broke. No temporary guy wires or other bracing were used. That's just utterly shocking. You know, if these members bend, they lose their stiffness, and then you get extra moments that are imparted, extra loading. It becomes totally unwieldy. So that's no doubt, in terms of OSHA findings, going to help the plaintiff's attorneys. There's been a number of lawsuits, wrongful death lawsuits, filed on behalf of those workers killed and injured. So if you total up all of Big D Builder's citations, they total $198,586, and indicates in the citation that they have 30 days to make that payment. Now back to inland crane citation. Citation 1, Item 1, type of violation, serious. Structural stability was not maintained at all times during the erection process. On January 31, 2024, and at times prior thereto, crane operators and ground personnel were exposed to structural collapse hazards during construction of a steel aircraft hangar. 4 cranes and ground crew worked to rig, lift, and support ground-assembled bays while they were placed on columns and joined at the middle peak. During hoisting and erection activities, there were significant visible lengthwise bends / curves in the solid web structural I-beam rafters. An out-of-plumb column and cable wires were snapping and breaking. So again, they were participating in the overall erection process, and apparently the crane operator didn't say, hey, I'm not doing this. This is out of control. We got to stop. And their citation came to a little over $10,000. So pretty much a slap on the wrist given what happened, but still it really paves the way for plaintiff's attorneys, since now inland crane was found to be at fault in this regard. So I want to talk about a couple of concepts relative to on-site safety at construction projects. I often go to bridge projects for construction phase testing, particularly of bridge foundations. And there's instances where I see things that are alarming or concerning. I was involved with a project one time at a nuclear power plant, and there was a big rush to create this excavation to expose some circ water piping so that braces could be added. And it was done under an emergency basis. And the excavation was about 20 foot deep, 50 by 50 in size roughly. And the sidewalls kept collapsing, and the contractor had about 15 crew members standing on the edge of this excavation. And I kept saying, you can't stand there, this thing's actively sloughing. They were standing there because they were holding tag lines and they were trying to move a trench shield into position. And because it was a nuclear power plant, the activities required having somebody, an armed security person, that was in radio contact with the control room. So after these guys repeatedly weren't listening, it was just a completely out of control situation. I walked over to the security person and said, please contact the control room and notify them that there's an unsafe activity at this location. And it had the desired result. The whole project was shut down until a safety meeting was held, and everybody kind of calmed down. They got into basically urgent mode to try and get what they wanted done, and was just focused on the task, and it just wasn't registering, even though I was telling them that it wasn't safe. So it's a interesting situation, because there was another engineer that was my peer at the project, and he didn't like what was going on either, but I was the one that was taking the lead trying to notify people that, hey, this isn't cool. And the other engineer just got in his car and left because he didn't want to be on the site. So, you know, it's sort of interesting in terms of liability and how things work in this country. You know, you certainly don't want to create extra liability for yourself or your employer. At the same time, as engineers, you have a primary responsibility for public safety and welfare. So you really have to speak up in these situations. Now, I don't know if there were any professionals doing inspection work at this site. There was a case study not too long ago where an engineer was on a construction site and unrelated to his activity, a contractor was saw cutting a reinforced concrete pipe that was on the bed of a truck, and they were cutting it lengthwise. And this engineer happened to walk by and continued on, and moments later this pipe opened up like a clamshell and crushed and killed 2 workers. And his company was successfully sued for not notifying those people of the inherent danger of what they were doing. So again, legal obligations are one thing. What a lawyer can prove at trial is another. But it's just unfortunate that these situations, these tragic situations occur. Now, I will say this as well. The research I've done indicates that Big D Builders is a non-union contractor. And I don't want to get into the whole union, non-union thing. There's advantages and disadvantages on either side. But one thing I will say, after roughly 40 years of experience, and a lot of that on construction sites, is that there tends to be a better safety culture on union projects. They are able to speak up and say, hey, this isn't cool, and really not worry about being fired as a result or sent home. And I've been on other projects that were non-union, and I saw some crazy things going on. And I know if anybody had spoken up with the work crew, they would have likely been sent home and later fired. So that's just food for thought on that topic. So let me know what you think in the comments section. I want to send a shout out to the channel members. It's growing ranks. They get to preview most of my videos well in advance of them becoming public. On the breaking news stories, I do push those out quickly, but there's other benefits for being a member. So again, I appreciate your support there. I also appreciate those of you who have provided super thanks. That's another great way to support the channel. Check out the links in the description. I've got free digital downloads about the largest civil engineering disasters for the past 100 years. I also have what I think is a great summary about the Artemis program to return people to the surface of the moon. So check that out. Thanks for watching, everyone.